Every civilization believes its money is real. It jingles in our pockets, shines in our vaults, and fills the screens of our bank accounts. Yet money has never truly been metal, paper, or code. It has always been something far more fragile: trust. From the earliest empires to the digital age, value has existed only because people agreed to believe in it. A coin stamped with a ruler's face wasn't valuable because of the portrait, but because people trusted that the state behind it would endure. When that belief cracked, even gold turned to dust. Trust is the invisible architecture that holds economies upright, and when it erodes, empires collapse long before their armies do. To understand how trust became the world's most powerful currency, we have to return to a time long before modern finance, to the Tang and Song dynasties of China, where the first paper promises began to replace heavy metal coins. In a world where trade routes stretched across continents, merchants needed speed and mobility more than weight and metal. They began depositing coins with reputable families or local officials who issued handwritten receipts in return. Early promissory notes backed not by gold, but by reputation. That paper, light as air, soon passed from hand to hand like money itself. It was the birth of symbolic wealth, value without weight, guaranteed only by trust. As the system grew, the Song emperors saw its potential and began issuing the world's first government-backed paper money, jiaozhi. For a time, it transformed China's economy, fueling trade from Persia to Korea. But power always tests its own limits. The state printed more notes than it could redeem, stretching faith until it tore. Inflation crept in, merchants refused paper, and the first monetary collapse born from overconfidence took shape. Centuries later, Marco Polo would write in awe of the Great Khan's paper currency. Black stamped notes made from mulberry bark, accepted everywhere as gold. He couldn't comprehend how mere paper held such power. But that was the point. The notes weren't backed by metal. They were backed by belief. China had discovered a truth that the world would spend the next 1,000 years learning and forgetting in cycles. That money is not a substance, but a story everyone agrees to tell. It was faith turned into finance, and trust, for the first time, had become currency. While China's experiment with paper money faded into memory, Europe was quietly preparing its own revolution. By the 13th century, the bustling cities of Florence, Venice, and Genoa had become crossroads of trade and ambition. Here, the merchants of Christendom faced the same challenge the Chinese once had. Metal was heavy, trade was vast, and carrying silver from port to port was both dangerous and slow. Out of necessity came innovation, and out of innovation came trust. Italian merchants began issuing bills of exchange, letters of credit, and promissory notes, each a promise to pay signed by men whose reputations were worth more than gold. A merchant could buy goods in London and settle the debt weeks later in Florence with a simple entry in a ledger. It was a miracle of faith disguised as bookkeeping. Wealth no longer needed to move in caravans or ships. It could move through signatures, symbols, and seals. The Florentine bankers learned that the value of money wasn't in what they held, but in what others believed they would honor. It was here, in these counting houses, that the modern world was born. The first double-entry ledgers, the DNA of capitalism, emerged not as mathematical tools, but as instruments of trust, proof that honesty and memory could be quantified on paper. Among those early dynasties of finance, one name rose higher than all others: the Medici. They built not only banks, but belief itself, a network of branches across Europe bound together by reputation. Popes, princes, and merchants trusted the Medici signature more than their own local currency. Their ledgers became the bloodstream of Renaissance commerce. But the very system that made them powerful also made them vulnerable. When one branch defaulted, suspicion rippled through all the rest. The same trust that had built their empire could now destroy it overnight. For the first time, the world witnessed a new kind of collapse. Not the fall of a kingdom, but the implosion of confidence. Yet from that instability emerged something lasting, the realization that trust could be institutionalized. Cities began to experiment with public credit, creating bonds and debt markets that allowed governments to borrow directly from their citizens. The Republic of Venice issued state bonds, Florence sold shares of its debt, and Amsterdam would soon follow with its revolutionary Bank of Exchange. In these experiments, trust ceased to be personal and became systemic. Woven into the fabric of governance itself, the age of merchants had ended. The age of finance had begun. As city-states and kingdoms discovered the power of public credit, money itself became political. The promise once made by merchants and bankers was now made by governments, and entire nations began to trade on reputation. In the 17th century, the Dutch Republic transformed that fragile idea into a science. Amsterdam's Bank of Exchange, founded in 1609, became the beating heart of European finance. For the first time, deposits were standardized, backed by the credibility of the city rather than the whim of individuals. It worked because people believed the Dutch would never default. Their discipline turned the guilder into the most trusted currency in Europe, and with that trust came empire. The Dutch financed their trade fleets, their wars, and their colonies through bonds sold to their own citizens. Promises written in ink, but powered by faith. Other nations took notice. England, emerging from civil war and chaos, adopted the same model, creating the Bank of England in 1694 to finance its wars against France. The invention of the console, a perpetual bond paying interest forever, turned national debt into a form of immortality. Investors didn't just trust England, they trusted that future generations would too. Trust had become hereditary. But the deeper the world built its foundations on faith, the more spectacular the cracks became when belief faltered. In the early 18th century, two experiments would reveal how fragile that new system truly was. In Paris, the Scottish economist John Law convinced the French crown that paper credit could replace metal entirely. His Mississippi company promised to turn colonial dreams into wealth, and his bank printed the notes to make it possible. For a moment, it worked. Speculation soared. Fortunes were made, and France felt modern. But when investors realized that the paper promises exceeded the real value behind them, trust evaporated in an instant. The Mississippi bubble burst, destroying savings and faith alike. In London, the South Sea Company repeated the same tragedy almost simultaneously, proving that the age of faith in finance had also become the age of illusion. Ordinary citizens learned that governments could inflate promises just as easily as emperors once diluted coins. And yet, even amid the ruin, the system endured. Because in every collapse, there were always those who continued to believe, not in kings or companies, but in the idea that trust, somehow, could be rebuilt. It was this paradox that defined modern finance. Its greatest weakness and its greatest strength were one and the same. By the dawn of the 20th century, the machinery of trust had become global. Central banks, stock exchanges, and international loans replaced merchants and monarchs as the keepers of credibility. Paper promises evolved into policies, and confidence became a measurable asset. Interest rates, credit scores, bond yields. When nations abandoned gold after World War I, they weren't just changing monetary systems. They were redefining belief. The value of money now rested entirely on political trust. Faith that governments would act responsibly, that banks would remain solvent, that societies would continue to function. But history rarely rewards blind faith. In 1929, that trust cracked once again. When the Great Depression struck, millions discovered that their savings were not security, but exposure. Stock certificates, bank deposits, government guarantees, all evaporated into the same illusion. The lesson once again was ancient. When promises multiply faster than proof, collapse is inevitable. And yet, the world rebuilt itself not by abandoning the idea of trust, but by institutionalizing it further. Nations formed the IMF and World Bank. Currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar itself was pegged to gold. It was a pyramid of faith, each layer resting on another, a vast monument to belief. But even gold could not hold the weight forever. In 1971, the United States severed the link, untethering global finance from its last tangible anchor. From that moment, every dollar in existence became pure trust, a promise with no metal beneath it, only memory and momentum. Today we live entirely inside that story. Our wealth exists as pixels, our savings as entries on remote servers, our currencies as faith in institutions we can no longer see. When banks fail, when inflation surges, when governments borrow without end, what collapses first is never the system. It's confidence. The 2008 financial crisis, the banking freezes in Lebanon, the silent devaluation of savings through inflation, all are symptoms of one repeating disease: too much trust placed in too few hands. But if history teaches anything, it is that collapse does not end the story. Each breakdown reshapes the rules, transferring power from the many who believed to the few who doubted early. In an age where money is no longer metal or paper, but code, the question returns with greater urgency. What is wealth when the ledger itself is virtual? Perhaps the next frontier of trust lies not in governments or banks, but in decentralized systems. Cryptographic promises designed to replace human faith with mathematics. Yet even then the cycle endures. Trust cannot be eliminated. It can only change form. From the merchants of Tang China to the traders of Wall Street, every generation has discovered the same truth: that money is not real until we believe it is. We live still in the age when trust is currency. The only question is how long that belief will last.